I watched my daughter charge a $13,000 cruise to my account while tossing me a $2 ticket her father-in-law praised as generosity. I kept carving roast, set my pocket watch by habit, and felt the house shrink. They recast favoritism as noble stewardship and branded my consent requirements controlling, even scheduling meetings in my living room without permission. So I shut access, reversed the charges, brought a witness, and drew one line that will not move. When family calls theft love, how would you answer? I am Marcus Hale, retired sergeant, widower, and stubborn keeper of routines. Sunday starts with lists on a clipboard, each box crisp and square. The roast goes in at 9, potatoes at 10, bread later. I wipe the counter twice, then check my flip-open pocket watch. Its hinge snaps cleanly, a small comfort I still trust. However, the house sounds too big when I move alone. I line plates like a formation and fold napkins to attention. A card table holds backup chairs because I plan for overflow. And I set out the chipped bowl my wife once liked for salad. My voice is steady, while I recite the checklist softly. The habit settles me the way morning runs once did. I retired years ago, yet the cadence never really left, so I confirm the invitations and the time windows again. I sent reminders yesterday with directions and parking notes attached. The phone buzzes with a spam alert I ignore. However, the preview line shows a bank logo and a number. I swipe it away and straighten the silverware by reflex. The doorbell rings at 11, earlier than anyone promised to arrive. My daughter Lauren leads the way with a smile practiced thin. Behind her, Ryan carries flowers, already scanning the family photos. Edward follows with cologne heavy and posture rich with entitlement. My shoulders inch inward before I pull them back to level. I greet them first, because that is what hosts do, and I balance courtesy with distance, the way a runner paces. Lauren slips a glossy envelope onto my table like a joke. She calls it playful, a little wager, nothing serious at all. I see a $2 lottery ticket tucked inside a receipt. Her smirk lands before her words do, and lingers longer. Edward laughs from the doorway and calls it spirited generosity. He says family fun should involve luck and grand gestures, not coupons. My chest tightens, then loosens as training flattens my voice. I thank them and place the ticket beside my pocket watch. However, Lauren is already reaching for a larger box with ribbons. The ribbon shimmers like money under my simple dining room lights. She cradles it and lets the lid breathe open slowly. Inside sits a leather folder and 2 cruise tickets with gold embossing. She announces Mediterranean ports and a private balcony with evening seating. Edward preens while Ryan lists amenities like a salesman on commission. Lauren adds that Edward deserves the best for everything he has done. I hear what goes unsaid and feel the room adjust. My fingers steady by habit as I set out glasses. The roast timer beeps, and I move toward the oven. I plate the meat, keeping slices even, sauce centered with care. However, quiet forms in the corners and spreads across faces. Margaret from next door arrives with pie and reads the room. She compliments the gravy because she senses a change in pressure. And she looks at me the way nurses do before storms. I keep the conversation on weather and the parade downtown. Lauren pivots to summer plans, conveniently naming weekends without consulting me. She mentions club events and sits closer to Edward for approval. He rewards her with a nod, while Ryan posts a photo. My pocket watch ticks louder in my head than usual. I reset it out of habit and slide it left 2 inches. The lottery ticket curls at the corner like a dismissed flyer. However, Lauren taps the ticket and tells everyone it is perfect. She calls it lighthearted and reminds me of ice cream money. My jaw sets as I pour iced tea without spilling a drop. Ryan suggests a toast to generosity and family traditions done right. Edward agrees and lifts his glass before others are ready. I lift mine on time, then keep my eyes down. The roast tastes fine, though my tongue reads salt as static. Margaret asks about the itinerary, because she fills silences mercifully. Lauren lists the ports again and sighs at the private balcony. She explains upgrades like she paid with her own savings. My breath shortens, then I count to 4 and hold. And I recall her student loans I carried through 2 winters. She chews slowly and studies the wall clock like a judge. Edward tells a story about rewarding effort with meaningful experiences. The story lands like a stamp on everything unspoken between us. I cut another slice, smaller, and plate it for Ryan. He declines politely because he prefers lighter lunches on weekends. However, he adds that expensive experiences create lasting memories for families. The table nods as if a price tag proves a lesson. I steady the serving fork and pivot to the side dishes. The salad bowl sits centered, the dressing spoon wiped clean. Lauren laughs softly and calls the lottery ticket charmingly humble. She mentions winnings as if they divide themselves neatly by blood. My shoulders shrink inward despite me. Then I straighten and breathe. I mark the moment in my head the way I mark maps. The soundscape sharpens. Forks, glass, a distant mower outside the window. A phone screen lights on the table with a bank logo. The notification reads, "Purchase approved," before Ryan palms it face down. I hold my face neutral because I have held worse positions, and I refill water glasses while air thins around my chest. Margaret asks Lauren about the ribbon because it looks familiar. Lauren says a boutique wrapped it because details matter for real gifts. My hand finds the pocket watch and closes the cover gently. I excuse myself to check the bread and breathe in the kitchen. The oven door sighs, and heat fogs my glasses briefly. I set the basket down and trim the edges with a knife. However, a printout peeks from the trash with a travel header. I slide it lower with the knife and return to the table. The ticket waits where I left it, curling more at the edge. Lauren notices and taps it again, calling it a keepsake worth framing. Edward chuckles and says framing belongs to things that took effort. The roast cools slowly as the room warms under shallow smiles. My voice thins, then flattens, and I ask about dessert timing. Margaret suggests now because sweet things help conversations find guardrails. We slice the pie, and the cinnamon steadies me a little. Ryan steps onto the porch to take a call discreetly. Edward checks the leather folder again like it might grow heavier. Lauren scrolls and posts, thumb moving in short, practiced bursts. My pocket watch clicks along, small and stubborn, beneath the ticket. However, I feel invisible at my own table, which is new. I clear plates while the others drift toward the living room. Laughter rises without me, then quiets when I re-enter with coffee. I pour carefully, leaving space at the top for cream. Lauren declines because she has a class at the club later. Edward asks for 2 sugars and accepts a second slice of pie. Ryan reappears and mentions a meeting scheduled in the afternoon. I nod and carry empties to the sink for the rinse. The faucet runs like rain I cannot hear fully today. I stack plates by size and turn the sponge in measured circles. And I count each circle like a drill to slow my pulse. When I turn back, the room has begun goodbyes without me. Lauren air kisses my cheek and calls the afternoon wonderful. Edward thanks me for hosting and says the surprise was worth it. Ryan claps my shoulder and says we should get together soon. Margaret squeezes my arm and tells me she will check in later. The door closes on perfumed air and a hallway quieter than morning. I stand still and listen for something that might pull me back. Only the clock in the hall answers with a soft, steady tick. I wipe the table slowly until the wood shows clean and dry. The lottery ticket sticks to a damp ring and peels away. I set it on the placemat and press the corners flat. However, the ribbon from the leather folder lies under a chair leg. I coil it and drop it into the drawer with rubber bands. My hands are steady, but my breath stays short and shallow. I open my pocket watch and watch the second hand sweep. Time moves whether I like the rhythm or not today. I sit with my clipboard and record the meal costs neatly. The numbers calm me because numbers obey when people do not. A charge floats up in memory with a travel company's name. I cannot place it, yet it scratches the back of my mind. My laptop rests on the counter with yesterday's statements still open. I close the lid because peace might live inside delay. And I line up the salt and pepper until they draw straight. The house around me feels smaller, as if walls leaned closer. My chest tightens again, then loosens under a breath counted slowly. I pick up the ticket and slide it under my pocket watch. The hinge clicks shut like a promise waiting for words I have not chosen. After the house emptied, I cleared plates slowly and reset the table. The rhythm steadied my hands even as my neck warmed uncomfortably. A bank icon glowed on my phone like a flare in fog. I opened the statement and saw a travel charge I never authorized. The amount sat heavy and exact, with a boutique agency's name attached. My breath shortened, then leveled as habit steadied my fingers again. I wrote the number, vendor, and timestamp onto my clipboard margins. However, I added a question mark beside authorization because facts need labels. I called Lauren for a simple check-in about budgeting and timing. She answered brightly and described generosity as a family value worth celebrating. She then implied shared funds covered meaningful gifts when occasions demanded something special. I repeated the amount and the date while keeping my voice even, and I asked who approved the purchase and why I was uninformed. She shifted to schedules and said today was too busy for details. She promised to revisit later and ended with a casual note about memories. I sat still until the dial tone ended and silence thickened. The air felt warmer around my collar, yet my fingers stayed precise. I printed the statement and circled the charge with a steady pen. However, I created a new page labeled Boundaries and noted today's conversation briefly. I listed house access, calendar use, and financial approvals in separate columns. Then I wrote simple rules with checkboxes because clarity reduces arguments later. I texted a calm request to meet Saturday and review shared logistics. Lauren replied with a link to an online calendar she already created. Her event used my address and described cruise planning in my living room. She added Edward as organizer and included Ryan on updates automatically, and she assigned the time without asking whether I was available that evening. I stared at my screen until the letters resolved into plain choices. Either I allow the frame, or I reset the frame carefully. I accepted the invite to keep it visible and moved to preparation. Chairs faced the mantel where family photos belong, not a corporate projector. I placed my chair near the entry, where hosts actually greet guests. However, I left a printed agenda on the coffee table for fairness. It listed duration, topics, and a note about decisions requiring my consent. Ryan texted that the meeting might run long because options require attention. He suggested moving furniture for better flow if the group expands tonight. I drafted a measured response stating seating stays as arranged for safety. I also noted end time because neighbors value quiet evenings on our street, and I put a timer on the mantel to keep discussion honest. The doorbell rang 20 minutes before the scheduled start, again without apology. Lauren arrived briskly and told me they secured upgrades at a discount. Edward followed with a binder and said we should cover tipping policies first. He set his binder on my agenda like a paperweight claiming ground. My breath shortened, but my hands remained still on the chair back. I invited everyone to sit where the cards indicated roles and timekeeping. However, Edward took my chair and said leadership should pick the best vantage. I rested my hand on the chair's top rail and waited exactly 3 seconds. Then I moved the chair 3 feet left and seated myself without comment. Ryan chose a side seat and opened a laptop half facing the hallway. Lauren sat forward and announced the balcony selection as a settled item. She said the vendor only holds premium cabins if family moves quickly. I wrote hold status beside her claim and marked the word unapproved, and I asked her to confirm which family member authorized any deposit. She said generosity covers deposits when families honor those who provide stability. Edward nodded and observed that decisive people cut through friction and delay. My neck flushed, yet I kept my voice flat and my notes legible. I asked whether my funds were used for the deposit last Thursday. Lauren smiled without answering and pivoted to excursions and dress codes. I noted evasion and underlined it once, because underlining twice announces emotion. Ryan proposed a slideshow, but I declined and pointed to the written agenda. However, he expanded charts anyway and dimmed lights without asking first. I stood and raised the blinds until the room returned to normal. The timer ticked, and I said we were behind the stated structure. Edward waved a hand and suggested informal flow delivers better outcomes tonight. I repeated the agenda line about decisions requiring my consent clearly. Lauren glanced at Ryan as if the plan needed a different opening. She then proposed finalizing gratuities in advance from the same household account. I wrote, "No under gratuities," and added "See approvals page for reference." My fingers stayed steady by habit while my breath worked harder. The laptop chimed with another alert I could not ignore. A pending charge appeared from the same agency labeled Upgrade Differential. I recorded the timestamp, then asked who initiated additional adjustments today. Lauren said details sometimes evolve when adults coordinate complex experiences. She also said suppliers demand rapid confirmations to protect family opportunities. And she added that I should trust her judgment, like always. I wrote her phrasing exactly and boxed it for later review. Edward leaned back and observed that older systems resist modern flexibility frequently. He suggested I let the younger team handle execution while I relax graciously. My jaw set, then loosened as I chose the next measured move. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with colored index cards. Each card marked a topic, owner, and need for explicit authorization. However, I placed one red card on the table, labeled Unauthorized Purchases. I listed the dollar figure, date, and my written refusal underneath. Ryan glanced up and asked whether we could table finance until later. He said experience design should lead because mood shapes decisions powerfully. I stated that finances shape mood more than mood shapes finances tonight. The timer beeped and I reset it, then shifted to calendar use. Lauren had booked my living room for 2 additional planning sessions already. She said recurring meetings help keep momentum when big moments approach quickly. I wrote venue control beside the entry and added requires homeowner consent. Edward asked whether we might relocate to a private club room instead. He offered his member rate and said parking would be simple for guests, and he suggested that my house invites clutter when groups expand organically. I thanked him and declined, citing capacity, security, and personal preference. The room cooled 3 degrees when I used the word security plainly. My breath shortened again, then deepened slowly until my pulse settled. The agenda advanced to decision rights and sign-off requirements for family expenditures. I explained that my name on funds means approvals pass through me. However, Lauren called that rigid and said families flourish under shared stewardship. She described stewardship as trusting those who deliver experiences efficiently. I replied by writing a single sentence large enough to read from distance. The sentence stated approvals are not a feeling. Approvals require consent, recorded. Ryan closed his laptop halfway and studied the binder quietly for once. Edward checked his watch, then suggested we wrap quickly and revisit tomorrow. I denied the extension because tonight's outcomes affect active financial exposure. The timer chimed, and I stacked the index cards into 2 piles. Approved remained small, while deferred and denied built height and weight, and the unauthorized ledger stayed in front of me like a bright flag. Lauren stood and announced they would proceed with what was already started. She said I would appreciate the results once everything fell into place. I wrote non-compliance and paused long enough to feel the word fully. My neck flushed, and heat touched my ears before fading gradually. I ended the meeting on time and walked them to the door. However, Lauren scheduled the next session from the porch without meeting my eyes. Ryan offered a quick wave, while Edward commented on outdated attitudes at home. I watched their taillights disappear and listened to the neighborhood settle. The kitchen clock counted seconds as I stacked paperwork by category. I photographed every page and saved duplicates to a locked folder. Then I wrote a brief summary of tonight's events with timestamps and actions. I added a column labeled Next Steps and left it blank deliberately. The blank square felt like a fuse that had not been touched yet. My breath shortened once more, then returned to an even, deliberate pattern. I placed the unauthorized ledger atop the clipboard and cleared the table completely. Enough. I washed the coffee mugs and set them upside down to dry. However, I left the customer service number beside the phone where morning lives. I sat in the dark room until the walls stopped leaning inward, and a quiet decision formed that did not need anyone's permission. Morning brought a clean checklist and a colder house. I brewed coffee, opened the laptop, and pulled 3 months of statements. The boutique agency charge sat there again. I highlighted it, saved a PDF, duplicated it to an external drive, then called the bank to remove all authorized users. The representative verified identity. I requested a new card number, daily limits, and real-time alerts over $50. She confirmed flags and opened disputes. I noted her badge number. I paused transfers to Lauren's household sub-account, stopped auto payments, reset email passwords and Wi-Fi, and updated door access for known visitors. On the vendor's portal, I requested itemized invoices using the booking code from yesterday's printout. The download listed passenger names, cabin category, and my account-ending digits as payer, processed last Thursday. I saved it and wrote "processed without consent" on my clipboard. I called the agency, declined a video call, and set a public meeting. We chose a diner off Route 18. I drove over, met the manager with her folder, and we reviewed the authorization sheet and device identifier. She said the booking used a saved profile and a familiar home address. I requested a statement noting payer identity and confirmation method, then wrote a concise dispute. Funds used without consent for non-essential luxury purchases. Primary owner denies authorization. Reversal requested. She warned reversals would trigger cancellations and automatic emails to passengers. I signed anyway, took stamped copies, scanned them, and recorded a memo with time, location, and outcome. Back home, I canceled future planning sessions at my house and messaged that my living room is no longer available. All household logistics require confirmation through me. Margaret texted a quick check-in. I labeled folders, approvals, disputes, and access audit, and slid the lottery ticket under my pocket watch. I photographed receipts. Then the printer produced the agency's auto email. Pending reversal, cabin inventory on hold 72 hours, co-travelers to receive cancellation notices if payment fails. I built a short timeline, linking decisions to consequences. House access audit. Next, gather spare keys, request rekeying for 2 exterior locks, reset the garage keypad, backup family photos, and restrict shared albums to view only. A bank alert pinged, declined attempt at a department store. I logged the timestamp and location and let the COM prove the boundary held. I drafted a letter memorializing removal of financial authorizations, printed 2 copies for certified mailing tomorrow. On the porch, a slowing car flashed Edward's vanity plate. He didn't stop. Inside, I sorted the binder he left, gratuities under denied, excursions under deferred, then shelved the leather folder. I reviewed last night's notes, added an evidence column, linked invoices, emails, and alerts, and scheduled a follow-up at the diner to capture a supervised screenshot of the authorization screen. A calendar invite arrived, cruise debrief at private club, from Edward, with Lauren and Ryan. I declined with 1 sentence, citing the dispute and frozen funds, logged the decline, and moved on. I cooked eggs, checked the mail, a glossy agency brochure, and filed it in hold for records. I reset the living room around family photos and put the timer away. I drafted a personal code for family finances, approval thresholds, documentation rules, consequences, and a rule that disputes move through written channels, not living rooms, then printed, signed, and sleeved it. A new alert noted passenger notifications scheduled for 7 this evening if payment failed. I pictured the ripple, rinsed a cup, and opened the disputes folder to list next steps, certified letters, lock pickup, and a conversation with the bank branch manager to obtain a written note confirming authorization removal and the recovery process, an anchor if this moved beyond family discussion. Every win costs energy. I glanced at the mantel, opened the pocket watch, watched 1 full rotation, then closed it over the ticket. A final agency email confirmed cancellations would trigger fees and emotional reactions among guests. I logged the cost of boundary and understood someone was already planning a harder pushback tonight. By afternoon, the backlash arrived exactly on schedule and louder than expected. Cancellation notices hit inboxes, and my phone started its steady vibration. I let messages stack while I logged timestamps on my clipboard. The air in the house cooled, as if discipline had a temperature. However, I moved through rooms with a deliberate pace that kept me centered. A neighbor's post circulated with a caption about stubborn fathers and generosity. I refused spectacle and returned to securing the essentials cleanly. I uploaded scanned copies of every invoice into a dated folder immediately. Then I labeled subfolders for authorizations, access, and vendor communications with care. A branch manager called back and confirmed the dispute procedure in writing, and he offered a same-day letter if I appeared before closing. I locked the front door, checked windows, and pocketed the list I needed. The drive downtown was steady, with lights hitting greens more often. Training kept my breathing easy as I parked beside the municipal complex. The bank sat across a city office corridor crowded with people and forms. I took a number, kept to myself, and read the posted timelines. However, when my turn came, I met the manager with my documents ready. He examined the packet while I kept my hands loose and open. He printed a letter confirming removal of authorizations and active reversal requests. I signed a receipt and asked for a branch stamp for completeness. He added a seal and slid 2 copies across the counter. I filed one inside the approval sleeve and thanked him precisely once. Outside, the corridor echoed with voices and shoes on polished floors. I stopped by a notary window and certified my personal policy document. The clerk stamped the page and entered it into their log for reference. I stayed silent and present, because calm carries farther than volume here. The phone buzzed with another wave of notifications I refused to open, and I returned home by surface streets where the pace fit my pulse. Margaret waved from her porch as I pulled into the driveway carefully. I lifted a hand in thanks and carried the mail inside. Bills stacked neatly, while a thick envelope bore a law firm's crest. I set the envelope down and prepared coffee before breaking any seal. However, I opened it when the cup steamed and the counter stood clean. The letter alleged misuse of family funds and implied diminished capacity plainly. It threatened injunctive relief and demanded immediate concessions under a proposed schedule. I read each line twice, then recorded sender, time, and demands without emotion. My breath stayed even while the letter waited under a paperweight. I made a copy for disputes and a copy for counsel later. The afternoon sun shifted across the dining table and reached the photos. I moved the frames slightly so glare would not hide familiar faces. Another alert reported attempts at a high-end store declined by safeguards. So I wrote the timestamp and store location, then returned to my list. The house felt orderly again, even with noise marching outside the walls. I prepared certified letters for tomorrow's post, with receipts already attached. I placed them near my keys so morning would start without friction. The door camera chimed with a visitor standing too close to the frame. Edward stood on my porch with a polished stance and a folder. He tried the handle gently while pretending to adjust a cufflink deliberately. I watched through the camera and chose to protect the boundary quietly. However, I used the intercom to state that meetings would occur by appointment. His gestures sharpened. He left a note and retreated to his car. I waited until the street emptied before collecting the single sheet. The note repeated legal language about guardianship and urgent financial oversight. I copied it, filed it, and wrote one line beneath the entry. Pressure prefers speed. Boundaries prefer process, I wrote in careful ink. A police cruiser rolled by, paused, and then edged to the curb. The officer approached with professional calm and asked for a brief welfare check. I invited him onto the driveway and presented identification without commentary. And I summarized a family dispute regarding unauthorized charges and active reversals. He observed the locks, the tidy yard, and the labeled folders in my arms. He logged the interaction and remarked that my account appeared orderly and clear. He wished me a good afternoon and returned to his vehicle without fuss. The cruiser's shadow left the pavement, and the street quieted perceptibly. I stood in the driveway a moment longer and let the quiet settle. Then I returned inside and wrote a brief note about the visit. However, I also wrote a reminder to request the officer's report number tomorrow. My hands had unclenched somewhere between the porch and the driveway. I noticed the absence of tremor and held that observation like ballast. The phone vibrated again with a link to a public post from Lauren. I did not open it, though I logged the time and the source. Another ping reported the club scheduling a forum about healthy family decisions. I ignored the invitation because forums rarely repair what discipline must. I cooked a simple dinner and ate at the table without background noise. The fork and plate made ordinary sounds that patched small holes inside. The bell rang once more with a courier holding a padded envelope. I signed for service and checked the sender before opening the package. The contents included a draft complaint and a request for preservation notices. I placed them under disputes and typed a quick chain of custody entry. and I added a note to duplicate the folder to the external drive. The sun tipped toward the horizon while the house returned to its rhythm. I wiped the counter, rinsed the cup, and left no dishes soaking. I closed blinds, checked the back door, and turned exterior lights to dusk. However, my breath tightened when a final email landed with a subject line. The subject referenced cancellations processed and non-refundable charges assessed by policy. I opened the message and read the breakdown in precise, neutral language. The fees were real, and the ripple would arrive by morning full force. I let the truth land and folded the email into the ledger calmly. The line labeled cost of boundary now carried a specific figure and date. I accepted the loss because dignity carries a price, like everything else. The house breathed with me while I stood still in the hallway. Then the door camera chimed again and showed two neighbors on the sidewalk. They spoke in low tones and checked my porch light twice before leaving. I wrote that detail down because patterns matter more than isolated gestures. A calendar alert announced a local news segment about summer travel deals. I muted the television instead and opened my list of essentials again. The list included medications, identification, wills, and a home inventory. I verified expiration dates and gathered documents into a fireproof envelope. The habit steadied me the way field kits steadied me years ago. However, I limited that memory because nostalgia steals attention from the present. A text arrived from Ryan suggesting everyone sleep on the situation overnight. He added that cooler heads might produce a workable middle ground tomorrow. I recorded his message and declined to respond because silence protects clarity. I set alarms for the post office and the bank branch opening hour. Then I carried the leather folder to a higher shelf with other records. The evening grew quiet, except for sprinklers and a distant dog barking. I walked the perimeter inside and tested every window latch once again. A second cruiser rolled by and did not stop this time, thankfully. I noted it and returned to the dining table to sort papers again. The family photos watched without judgment while I completed the checklist calmly. Another email landed from the travel agency's compliance officer near closing time. The officer requested an interview about authorization discrepancies and device fingerprints. I agreed to a call tomorrow and saved the message into the disputes folder, and I added a line that the agency might confirm who completed certain fields. The edges of my jaw softened as I prepared for a final task. I opened a new document and captured an executive summary of events. The summary fixed the sequence in place if anyone questioned the timeline later. The printer hummed, and pages slid into a manila folder labeled Master. I locked that drawer and placed the key on a ring beside the ledger. However, a late ping lit the phone with a different sort of pressure. Lauren's post count had multiplied, and mutual friends began forwarding concern notes. I read none of them. I wrote that I had read none. The act of not engaging felt like a steel rod through the spine. The doorbell rang one last time with no figure on the camera. A small package waited on the doormat with no return address visible. I opened it inside and found a USB drive and a note card. The card contained a time, a table number, and a single word, witness. I weighed the risk and placed the drive into a quarantined laptop. The files held photographs from Sunday's table, each stamped with timed metadata. One sequence showed Lauren sliding the lottery ticket toward my plate. Another showed Edward raising his glass while Ryan focused on his screen. Margaret's hand hovered over the pie, and my eyes studied the roast. And the ticket sat in front of me, while the envelope's ribbon glinted nearby. The last image showed a reflection in the china cabinet glass behind us. A man stood near the doorway, holding his phone at an angle. I enlarged the frame until pixels squared into a useful outline and features. The face belonged to an older gentleman I had seen leaving earlier. He wore a jacket with a club pin I recognized from the brochures. However, the note card's time matched the private club's lounge hours exactly. I recorded the file hash and copied the images to the external drive. Then I restored laptop settings and ejected the drive to a labeled envelope. The house fell quiet again while I stood under the hallway light. A car moved slowly past, then accelerated at the corner without stopping. I breathed in through my nose and let the exhale carry weight away. My voice felt stable again, though no one heard it but me. Another email arrived from the bank confirming case numbers for the disputes. I wrote those numbers on the clipboard and placed it flat on the table. The room's edges felt square again, corners aligned with my expectations. I checked the locks one final time and dimmed the lights for evening. The heavy blow had landed, and the ledger carried its full number now. I let that number stand without bargaining, because bargaining wastes good energy. I understood that a different blow might still be forming for morning. I stood at the front window and watched the street find stillness. Then the phone vibrated softly with a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. The transcription showed a surname that matched Edward's family perfectly. It stated a request to meet regarding something witnessed on Sunday afternoon, and it suggested the booth at Murphy's near the courthouse, tomorrow at 10. Morning arrived with a steadier pulse and a plan I could carry. I dressed plain, checked my folders, and left early for Murphy's. The booth near the window let me face both the door and counter. A man approached at exactly 10 with the club pin on his lapel. He introduced himself as Walter Keene, with a calm nod and measured breath. He placed a small envelope on the table and asked for coffee. I kept my posture open and slid the disputes folder between us carefully. He said he had attended Sunday's gathering as Edward's guest before leaving early. He stated that Lauren presented the lottery ticket as a Father's Day gift. He added that there was no discussion of percentages or any conditional arrangement, and he said the ribboned folder followed later with different intentions and a louder tone. Walter produced 4 printed photographs with clear timestamps aligned to the afternoon timeline. He had mirrored them from a staff member who manages event photography discreetly. The images matched the USB sequence I received at home last night. His voice stayed low while he explained why he had requested this meeting today. He said he raised his son to value integrity over performance and applause. He acknowledged disappointment and offered to set the record straight publicly and formally. I summarized the dispute facts and showed the stamped bank letter about authorizations. He read every line and then slid a card with his counsel's number. He stated a willingness to sign a declaration and appear if proceedings escalate. He requested only accuracy and a reasonable tone that avoids humiliation for anyone. We shook hands without ceremony, and he asked the server for the check. I paid before his pen touched the bill because the gesture belonged here. The exchange carried a weight that shifted the angle of the week decisively. Outside, midday heat bounced from the pavement as traffic whispered along Main. I logged the meeting time, location, and materials, and photographed the envelope. Then I drove straight to the agency office 2 blocks past the courthouse entrance. Their compliance officer called me in quickly and asked for a short statement. I provided the timeline, the device identifier, and the witness name for records. She confirmed that the booking originated from a saved profile on a new device. She added that the device fingerprint matched an attempt at a department store yesterday, and she promised a written summary by end of day with action items listed. I documented her badge number and the expected delivery time precisely in ink. She requested permission to contact involved parties with follow-up verification questions today. I agreed and asked to be copied on all communications moving forward. The lobby doors opened and closed while I filed each detail mentally. I left the building with the sun at my back and steady steps. The phone buzzed with messages building like a storm I refused to watch. So I returned home and placed the new materials onto the dining table. Margaret knocked and offered the pie tin with a fresh note of cinnamon. She said neighbors were restless while social posts grew louder by the hour. She also said some people needed a simple truth they could repeat cleanly. I thanked her briefly and returned to the stack without unnecessary commentary. The courier delivered a thick packet from Walter's counsel by mid-afternoon. The packet contained a signed declaration and a permission letter for photographs. It also held a brief statement Walter planned to share on his networks. His statement was calm and specific, with no attack language or grandstanding. It focused on facts, sequence, and an appeal to decency within the community. I scanned everything and archived files to the external drive as before. Then I drafted a 1-page summary that tied each proof to a consequence. I numbered each exhibit and linked it to Sunday's moments by timestamps and positions. I highlighted the authorization removal, the reversal, and the attempted guarded purchases. And I reserved a line for the agency's compliance letter expected before closing time. The doorbell rang, with a familiar pattern of urgent presses and short pauses. Lauren stood on the porch with Ryan behind her and Edward on the walkway. Their posture announced a move for control before a single word reached me. I stepped onto the front porch and closed the door gently behind me. The stack of documents rested on the entry table inside within easy reach. My chest opened, and my stance squared to the boards I repaired last spring. Lauren gestured toward the car and asked to resolve misunderstandings quickly and privately. She insisted that emotions had run high and that public chatter had distorted intentions. She suggested that family should heal quietly and find a middle path by supper time. Edward stood with arms crossed and a folder angled like a badge of rank. He began a familiar lecture about modern flexibility and the burden of old systems. He implied that I had overreacted and harmed relationships with a rigid approach. Ryan attempted a calmer tone and asked if we could reset planning structures today. He proposed neutral facilitators, alternative payments, and an agreement not to revisit blame. I listened without interrupting because recording silence can change the shape of noise. Then I stated the day's sequence and the new facts confirmed by external parties. I explained the reversal process and the documented device fingerprint from the vendor. I summarized the signed declaration from Walter and the photographs received yesterday. I added that compliance would issue a letter tying the device to recent attempts. I stated that defamatory posts created measurable harm and exposed everyone to greater risk. And I concluded with a clear structure for amends, next steps, and expected behavior. I said reimbursement of assessed fees would be paid by those who initiated purchases. I said public corrections would match the reach of the original posts proportionally. I said future planning would occur off my property, under written invitation only. I said access, finances, and schedules would follow the policy I filed yesterday. And I said that continued misrepresentation would move to council with no further discussion. Edward scoffed audibly and declared that a court would handle this within days. He lifted his folder as if it were a gavel that could strike my porch. Lauren's face tightened, and she accused me of turning family into procedures. Ryan asked me to consider the emotional cost of making everything so formal. My breath stayed even as the street hummed behind their tightly parked car. I stepped to the threshold and spoke the only sentence that needed emphasis. I state that dignity in this house is not negotiable. The words landed cleanly and left a level surface beneath my feet. I opened the door, retrieved the summary, and handed each person a copy. I pointed to the section with the photographs and the witness declaration references. I also pointed to the line reserving space for the compliance letter arriving today. Lauren scanned the pages quickly and then stopped at the witness name. She looked toward the street where a black sedan idled with tinted windows. Edward shifted, and for the first time, the certainty left his shoulders. Ryan studied the photographs and noted the timestamps aligned to Sunday's meal. He asked softly whether the images would be shared beyond necessary channels. I answered that only essential parties and specific corrections would see the materials. I added that an apology could shorten the runway and lower the personal cost. Edward bristled and warned that this path would burn bridges beyond repair. Lauren's phone vibrated, and she glanced at the screen with widening eyes. The agency's compliance letter had arrived with findings and delivery receipts attached. The message tied the booking to a device ID matching yesterday's declined attempt. It also noted recorded calls and the absence of permission from the primary account. I watched the three of them absorb a shift they did not plan to carry. The porch boards held firm under my weight, while air cooled under the eaves. Margaret watered roses across the street and pretended not to watch our stance. A gust lifted the edges of the papers and then set them down decisively. I restated the amends list and the deadlines, then ended the meeting clearly. I invited written responses within 48 hours with receipts for any reimbursements. I requested that public corrections mirror reach and include simple, verifiable facts. I kept my tone level because volume would hand away what I just earned. Edward started to step forward, then stopped when he saw the camera light. He turned without speaking and signaled Ryan to follow him to the car. Lauren lingered on the porch and asked whether repair was still possible later. I replied that boundaries protect repair by preventing further unnecessary damage daily. She nodded once and walked toward the idling car with measured steps. The engine growled, then softened as the car pulled away from my curb. I stood still until the street noise faded into the usual afternoon rhythm. Then I returned inside and filed the signed declaration and compliance letter together. I emailed the agency officer a brief thank you and acknowledgement of receipt. I also sent a concise note to the branch manager with updated attachments. The room felt lighter, and my posture found an honest center again. The clock in the hall marked the hour with a gentle mechanical click. I cooked a late lunch and ate at the table where Sunday had started. The chair sat where it belonged, and the air inside stayed calm. My phone buzzed with messages changing shape from accusation toward silence. A neighbor forwarded Walter's public statement, which was factual and restrained. The comments below were measured now and asked for patience and fairness. I breathed in slowly and recognized a weight lifting that had lived all week. I carried the recycling out and rolled the bin to the curb carefully. The sun had shifted west, and shadows drew longer across the sidewalk. Margaret waved once and returned the empty pie tin with a new recipe card. She said people were reconsidering earlier judgments after reading a few updates. She mentioned that quiet truth travels slowly, but holds better once it arrives. I returned to the porch and sat for one long minute facing the street. The air felt ordinary again, the kind of ordinary that repairs small tears. I stood, gathered the remaining papers, and straightened the stack by habit. A final email landed with a subject line about agency account security enhancements. The message offered two-factor authentication and a separate authorization key for bookings. I accepted and set it up immediately because future storms prefer hard targets. The printer warmed and produced a confirmation page for the new controls. I placed it inside the approvals sleeve and closed the cabinet with a solid click. The house exhaled with me, and my steps felt even across the floorboards. I wiped the counter, locked the side door, and checked the porch camera. The street lay quiet under soft light and the low whir of air conditioners. My phone chimed once more with a short message from an unknown sender. It contained a single line acknowledging receipt of my summary and deadlines, and it added that a draft correction was being prepared for posting tonight. By evening, the neighborhood had gone quiet, and the inbox cooled noticeably. I slept without alarms and woke before sunrise with a light chest. The house felt aligned again, like a room after proper field inspection. I brewed coffee, opened blinds, and checked folders without bracing for impact. The agency's letter sat atop the stack, crisp and decisive already, and the bank confirmations nested beneath it like well-packed gear in transit. I ate toast slowly and mapped a short route for morning errands. The plan required no improvisation, which steadied me more than caffeine. I carried the master folder to the car with even steps. The sky over Maple Street held a pale band of patient light. However, a single message arrived from Lauren before the ignition caught. She wrote that a draft correction would post at noon with acknowledgments. She added that fees would be reimbursed today using their own accounts. I read it twice and filed it under actions promised with the date. Then I drove to the post office and mailed certified copies calmly. The clerk stamped receipts while I logged times on the clipboard edges. He mentioned Veterans Coffee in the church hall and nodded toward the bulletin. I considered it, then declined politely because quiet work still had priority. The bank manager met me briefly and handed a final confirmation page. It summarized dispute status, reversals, and the security notes we activated yesterday. I thanked him once and asked for a second stamped copy immediately. He obliged, and I filed both into approvals before leaving the branch. The air outside tasted like cut grass and fresh concrete after rain, so I took the long block home and let the pulse stay slow. Margaret waved from her walkway and lifted a small bag of biscuits. She set it on my porch table and said nothing from across the shrubs. I raised 2 fingers in thanks and returned to my entry quietly. The house greeted me with ordinary sounds that fit their spaces today. I placed biscuits near the ledger and poured another half cup of coffee. However, I did not open social feeds or scan commentary for temperature. I calibrated by tasks instead, not by moods negotiated in public rooms. I tightened a cabinet hinge that had been wobbly all month. Then I cleaned the stove grate and oiled the back door latch. Small repairs move minds forward when big repairs finish their heavy lifting. The phone vibrated with a reimbursement receipt at 10:41 a.m. sharp. A second arrived at 10:45 with the upgrade differential restored completely. I downloaded both and noted settled beside the earlier line items, and I moved those entries from active to closed in the disputes log. The printer hummed, and pages slid warm into their labeled sleeves. I felt breath deepen without effort, while the stack lost visible height. Noon approached, and I stood at the kitchen window with the clock. A chime sounded as Lauren's correction posted across her main accounts. She wrote clearly that purchases had been initiated without required permission. She wrote that authorizations had been removed appropriately after discovery and review. She added that posts made earlier overstated claims and contributed to confusion. And she apologized to neighbors for dragging family matters into public spaces. I read it once and filed a screenshot into the corrections folder immediately. Comments below asked for privacy and patience rather than fuel and spectacle. The street stayed quiet, and sprinklers resumed their usual late summer cadence. I closed the browser and refused to linger where victory tempts gloating. The pocket watch lay beside the clipboard, hinge bright in early light. I opened it once and watched the second hand circle cleanly. The movement ticked like a calm metronome, guiding smaller steps forward. However, the next step required me to define future contact, without guesswork. I drafted a standing check-in for the first Sunday of every month. The plan allowed 15 minutes by phone, unless escalations required documentation. I added a clause that financial topics must appear in writing beforehand. Then I printed the page, signed it, and slid it near approvals. I sent the proposal by email with 3 lines and no ornament. Lauren responded within an hour with a yes and a request. She asked whether we could meet once to return keys and schedules. She also asked whether I would accept a face-to-face apology at home. I read the lines slowly, then offered the workshop as neutral ground tomorrow. The bench carries clarity because tools insist on purpose and sequence together. She agreed and asked whether Ryan should attend for completeness and support. I replied that she should come alone first for a direct conversation, and I scheduled 30 minutes with a stop time and phone record set. Afternoon drifted gently, and I let it pass without building a new task. I vacuumed the hall runner and wiped fingerprints from door glass slowly. I ate Margaret's biscuit and saved the rest for later with thanks. The house had a sound again that matched its measured bones. My shoulders loosened as the sun slid toward the fence posts quietly. I prepared the workshop for tomorrow with 2 chairs at the bench. I set a small picture frame project beside a carpentry square thoughtfully. The frame would hold a photo I had moved to the mantel yesterday. It showed Lauren with my late wife on a windy shore long ago. However, I left the frame unfinished because the last side needed careful joining. The bench light pooled softly across sandpaper, clamps, and a small brush. The pocket watch rested on a clean rag where the sawdust could not reach. I closed the door and wrote a 3-line outline for tomorrow's conversation. The outline listed goals, boundaries, and outcomes without adjectives or weather. I cooked a simple dinner, then walked the perimeter as dusk settled. Margaret's porch light clicked on, and a kid pedaled slowly down Maple. The world looked ordinary, which felt like privilege after several loud days. I slept early and rose before the alarm with an easy chest. Coffee steamed while the shop lights warmed to a steady glow. The morning smelled like pine and oil and a little dust. Lauren arrived on time, parked straight, and walked up the drive slowly. She carried a small envelope and held a key ring in her hand. I met her at the workshop door and gestured toward the bench chairs. She placed the keys on the bench without comment and sat carefully. And she set the envelope beside the carpentry square, keeping her eyes down. I stated that the reimbursements had arrived and the corrections were posted. I added that the agency letter and bank confirmations closed the dispute. I then said future coordination would follow the policy I filed yesterday. She nodded and said she understood the structure and would follow it. She said stress and pressure had driven reckless decisions she now regretted. However, I kept the focus on behaviors, responsibilities, and specific repair steps. I stated the monthly check-in plan and the 15-minute cap clearly. I stated that home access ended indefinitely and would be revisited next spring. I stated that finances would never route through shared assumptions again, and I stated that apologies earn traction when paired with sustained, observable changes. She handed me the envelope and said it contained a handwritten apology. She said she had notified the club that our house was off limits. She said she would handle any remaining fees beyond those already returned. I logged the handoff silently and placed the envelope into the actions folder. The workshop stayed quiet, holding the conversation without taking any sides. I slid the unfinished frame forward and tapped the fourth side lightly. I asked whether she would help sand the joint before I glued it. She nodded and reached for a sheet with careful fingers and slow breaths. We sanded in small strokes while the bench light edged the wood. Dust lifted, then settled, as the corner found a clean, square meeting. The act asked nothing grand and delivered something tidy and human instead. However, I declined any attempt to rewrite the week into a misunderstanding. She kept her eyes on the frame and said that clarity would hold. She asked whether I might consider seeing her next month at the church hall. She said she planned to attend the veterans' coffee and bring muffins respectfully. I weighed the request against the policy and the calendar I already drafted. I said the first Sunday call would decide any in-person contact thereafter. I said she could send details in writing, and I would answer plainly. And I said the workshop would remain off-limits except for scheduled task work. We finished sanding, and I brushed grain dust toward a small tray. I spread a thin line of glue and pressed the joint into square. The clamp tightened with a quiet click that sounded like progress made. The frame held its line, and the corner looked honest under the light. Lauren stood and asked if she could leave a final item. She placed the ribbon from Sunday's leather folder on the bench gently. She said it belonged in a drawer far from decisions for a while. I placed it into a tin with spare screws and labeled it miscellaneous ribbon. The tin shut with a lid that preferred function over any sentiment today. She asked whether we were all right enough to start from here carefully. However, I answered only with the process already written on paper yesterday. She nodded and wiped a small line of dust from her sleeve. She said thank you for the meeting and the chance to help briefly. She stepped into the daylight and walked to the car without hurry. The engine faded down the block and left the morning still behind. I stood at the bench and watched the clamp hold the corner true. The pocket watch clicked beside the rag, steady and stubborn as ever. I closed it and slid it into my pocket for the rest of the day. I wrote a short summary of the meeting and filed it under resolved. Then I moved the envelope with her apology into a separate binder calmly. I brewed fresh coffee and took a mug to the front steps slowly. Margaret waved from across the street and lifted a grocery flyer toward me. She called that the church hall buffet always needed more hands on Saturdays. I raised a hand in acknowledgement and considered an hour after lunch tomorrow. The idea carried weight without dragging me into someone else's theater. So I penciled it onto the calendar and returned to the workshop contentedly. The clamp released after curing, and the joint remained clean and square. I set the photo inside and pressed the backing gently into place. The two figures on the windy shore looked back with quiet courage. The frame stood upright on the bench, simple and without comment. However, I carried it to the mantel and cleared a proper spot carefully. I placed it beside the folded flag case that has guarded our living room. The picture and the flag balanced the room better than yesterday's noise. I wrote a small card for the frame with names and the year. I slid the card behind the backing because identification matters more over time. Afternoon brought a final email from the agency about security upgrades deployed. It confirmed two-factor authentication and a locked authorization list under my control. I printed the confirmation and saved a copy to the external drive. Then I walked the neighborhood loop and let the body stretch its own knots. A boy threw a football poorly, then laughed when it wobbled downfield. A dog barked at a mailbox and then remembered its dignity with effort. The world stayed ordinary, which meant we had done something right enough. I returned home and set the monthly reminder inside the wall calendar. The note used plain words and a time that fits both schedules. I deleted old recurring events that no longer belong inside these walls, and I labeled a new folder called Future, leaving it half an inch thick. Evening settled across the porch with long shadows and a stable breeze. I grilled a small piece of chicken and ate with a simple salad. I washed the plate and left the sink empty and quiet again. The phone remained on the table, face down, and finally still. However, one message arrived from Ryan acknowledging receipt of my summary yesterday. He wrote that he would correct his earlier comments and step back from planning. He wrote that he supported the new structure and would avoid drama completely. I filed it without commentary and marked behavior to watch in the ledger. The ledger now held more closed boxes than open ones across its pages. That ratio matters because closure feeds calm better than any speech. Night arrived without sirens, knocks, or reporters on the block. The porch camera recorded moths and a raccoon passing like a bored sentinel. I checked the locks, turned the exterior lights to their timers, and exhaled. The house held its shape under my hand, like a ship after repairs. I sat at the dining table and opened the pocket watch once more. The second hand swept past the 12 and kept its steady cadence. I remembered early formations where patience traveled farther than volume or speed. I closed the watch and placed it beside the finished frame on purpose. The two objects carried different histories and one shared direction now. I wrote a final entry in the master summary with today's outcomes recorded. I ended with a line about presence, policy, and kindness under pressure. Then I filed the document and locked the drawer with a practiced turn. Peace, finally. However, I understand peace holds only when paired with boundaries and maintenance. I will repair what is repairable and release what refuses repair. I will give gratitude where behavior earns it and keep grace conditional. And I will protect human value with steadiness, not spectacle, every single time.